Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand.
And today, we are diving deep into a question that, it keeps revolutionaries and therapists up at night. It's a question rooted in the profound intellectual conflict of Frantz Fanon.
And what's that question?
What if the only way to achieve real, fundamental, lasting change, whether it's curing a severe mental illness or overthrowing a colonial regime, is to first hit the human reset button and embrace annihilation?
Okay, wow, let's unpack that. That's a dramatic idea. Most people, when they think of Frantz Fanon, they think of his explosive political theory, right?
Sure, things like The Wretched of the Earth, his manifestos on decolonization.
Exactly. But today, we're actually setting those aside. Our deep dive is into his earlier, and I'd argue maybe more fundamental thought process. We're drawing on his collected psychiatric papers in a really explosive early student play called Parallel Hands.
And they're all gathered together in the collection Alienation and Freedom. What we're doing here is we're hunting for a tension that runs throughout Fanon's entire career.
A kind of hidden logic.
The source material we're using today calls it a subterranean mode of thought. It's this intellectual fight that persists just beneath his more famous political work.
And the existential itch, as we like to call it, is so deeply personal and political. How do you achieve fundamental lasting change when you're completely embedded in a system that's actively oppressing you?
Whether that system is a psychiatric institution or a colonial regime, these systems seem to dictate the very limits of what is possible.
Yeah.
How do you break out?
And this brings us straight to the core binary of this entire deep dive. It's a conflict between two models of change. On one side is transformation a slow, reasoned overcoming, a process of incorporating the old while moving to a new state.
We can call that translation. It's the Hegelian model, gradual synthesis.
Right. Or is change something else entirely?
Is it a violent, absolute annihilation and creation from nothing? Are you scrapping the machine's operating system to install an entirely new one?
And we'll call that transmutation, the Nietzschean model. Total rupture, voiding the past to affirm something new.
So that's the fight. The Hegelian ideal of dialectical overcoming versus the radical Nietzschean demand for non-dialectical annihilation.
And what's so fascinating here, and what we're going to trace, is that these two forces don't just, sit on opposite sides. They often rely on each other.
That's the key insight. Our source material suggests the non-dialectical jolt, that moment of annihilation, is sometimes the only thing that can kickstart the dialectical process when it just stalls out.
So if the system is paralyzed by oppression or, say, a deep neurosis, you actually need to blow it up just to get it moving again.
It's that initial moment of total rupture that allows the hard, careful work of gradual change and synthesis to even begin.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace this intellectual split in two through Fanon's clinical practice, starting in France, moving to colonial Algeria, and then seeing the whole philosophical battle staged openly in his dramatic work.
And look, this is so much more than just academic theory. This is about Fanon the psychiatrist wrestling with the ethical and practical limits of healing under truly oppressive conditions. We're tracking that moment where gradual reform just hits a brick wall.
And the only thing left is revolution, internal or external.
Exactly.
Right, so let's start this journey in 1951. Fanon is doing his residency at the St. Alban Clinic in France.
A really important place. He trained there under François Tosquel, who is a hugely influential figure in European psychiatry. And this is where Fanon was first introduced to institutional psychotherapy.
And this wasn't your standard approach to mental health, was it?
Not at all. Institutional psychotherapy was, in its very DNA, a revolutionary method. You have to remember, Tosquel was a Marxist, anti-fascist activist. His treatment method was a direct product of his political convictions.
So the aim was, what, twofold?
Yes, exactly. You treat the mental illness, of course, but at the same time, you fight the institutional oppression, the isolation, the rigid punitive hierarchies of the asylum that they believed often worsened a patient's health.
They saw the traditional asylum as being pathological itself.
Inherently pathological.
Yeah.
So instead of just isolating patients, which was the standard practice, they transformed the hospital environment itself. They created what they called a neo-society.
A neo-society. So this meant communal group activities.
That's right. Patients were participating in theater, choral performances, craft making, and these really interesting open forums to discuss the daily life of the hospital.
The goal being to facilitate connections, restore some dignity, and actively disalienate patients who'd been stripped of their social roles.
Precisely. And the journal they produced, it was titled Trait d'Union.
Hyphen.
Hyphen. It perfectly symbolizes this whole approach, the hyphen connects. It signifies that intersubjective social dimension of the work uniting individuals and the hospital into one collective practice.
That hyphen, the trait yin, that sounds perfectly Hegelian to me. It's embodying synthesis. It's the link between what were previously seen as opposites, the individual illness and the collective cure.
It really does. It speaks to the essence of dialectical synthesis. It's all about translation. That gentle, cooperative, slow process of integrating the patient back into a functional, supportive social structure.
But, and there's always a but.
There's always a but. The tension arises when this cooperative social therapy just wasn't enough for the most severe chronic cases.
That's when they brought in what you called the heavy artillery.
That's exactly it. Shock therapy. This is the stage of annihilation and the dialectic of the cure.
Okay. To really understand this conflict, we need to look at a specific case Fanon and Toskel's documented. It's the case of a 45-year-old nun.
Yeah, she was suffering from severe delusions of persecution, psychomotor agitation. I mean, this was a very serious case. And this wasn't a quick fix. This was a complete structural intervention.
And their treatment was incredibly structured, wasn't it? It ran through 3 distinct stages.
Very distinct stages, yeah, that illustrate this delicate balance between organic and psychotherapeutic treatments.
So stage 1, what was that?
Stage 1 was the foundation. A period of sedation using narcosis combined with what they called active intervention psychotherapy. This was the attempt to gently unveil and address the psychological roots of her behavior with talk therapy.
The gentle approach first.
Always. But then came the crucial moment, the moment of pure, undiluted Nietzschean rupture. Stage 2. Annihilation therapy.
The name alone.
The name says it all. This involved 5 days of intensive electroconvulsive shock, and it was deliberately designed to lead to the dissolution of the patient's personality and her entrance into a deep, amnesiac confusional state.
My God. So this was effectively the nuclear option, a drastic mental reset button, just wiping the hard drive clean.
Completely. And Fanon and Toskel's were very explicit that this wasn't the cure itself. It was a necessary, violent precondition.
Because the existing pathological personality structure had just proven impenetrable.
Exactly. It was stalled, locked in an neurotic loop. Annihilation was needed to break that loop.
And then after that, they can move to stage 3.
Which was reconstruction. This involved 40 days of insulin shock therapy paired with intensive institutional psychotherapy. The goal now was the rediscovery of the ego in the world.
How did they do that?
By systematically working through the patient's most significant life events, what they call the complexual nodes.
So the patient, with the therapist's help, had to actively reconstruct herself.
That's it. And the text uses a key French term that really defines this entire discussion. The patient went beyond a dépassé each of these conflicts, facilitating their overcoming.
Okay, let's pause on that word, dépassement. This is crucial for you listening. When we translate dépassement simply as overcoming, we lose a lot of the Hegelian complexity. It's not just about getting past something, is it?
Not at all. Dépassement means to cancel, but also to preserve and finally to elevate. It's that classic dialectical movement. The old personality is canceled and preserved in such a way that the patient returns as a qualitatively different person.
You don't just discard the past.
No, you update the software while carrying forward the essential data, creating a more robust system.
But here's where that subtle tension, the philosophical friction we're hunting for, is hiding inside these clinical notes. If you look closely at the description of the annihilation stage, it creates what the source calls a tabula rasa conflict.
Ah, yes. The conflict between the ideal and the practice. Annihilation therapy is supposed to wipe the slate clean, erase memory, and self-sense. The patient, when they awake from the coma, is described as being on the same plane of maternal confusion in which one comes into the world.
It suggests an authentic birth, starting from scratch.
But, and this is the key question, if the slate is truly blank, a tabula rasa, how can the patient then spend the next 40 days recovering memories and working through past conflicts?
Right. If everything was truly destroyed, there would be nothing left to overcome or re-examine. The source actually notes that much of what has been wiped clean returns in a radically modified form.
Which suggests the old self wasn't erased in totality, but radically modified. And that fits the Hegelian model of preservation and sublation.
So this is the subterranean glimmer we're tracking, we have to ask. Was the shock, the annihilation, just a moment of negativity within a dialectic? A necessary harsh step before the Hegelian synthesis could happen?
Or was it a purely non-dialectical procedure? a moment of total rupture that was necessary only to violently jolt a stalled psychotherapy back into motion.
The critique we're following suggests it's the latter, that they used this extreme method only when the illness created a paralysis that halted the normal dialectical movement of their therapy.
The rupture doesn't replace the dialectics, it reanimates it. It clears the board so the pieces can start to move again. The problem wasn't the method, it was the stasis.
And this tension, it surfaces again in that trading editorial that Fanon wrote, doesn't it? Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He praises memory, but then he issues this profound warning against stasis.
It's a fantastic quote. He says, "Memory ought not to get the upper hand with man. Memory is often the mother of tradition."
That feels like a direct challenge to the Hegelian model, which demands respect for the process of history. Fanon is saying you have to go beyond de passé, that tradition.
Right, and if you read this through a Hegelian lens, de passé is that dialectical overcoming we talked about. You're translating the past, honoring it by improving upon it so a new life issues from its afterlife.
But the Nietzschean reading sees something totally different, a divergent form of overcoming, a transvaluation.
Which aligns perfectly with Zarathustra's Overman, the creator who is also an annihilator. This kind of overcoming is opposed to preserving, but also to appropriating. It's a call to transvaluate values, not just translate them.
And to transvaluate means to what? Categorically void the value of the current system entirely rather than negotiating with it.
Exactly. It means recognizing that the weight of history, that tradition, is sometimes actively detrimental. Fanon the psychiatrist is making what the source calls an untimely observation, that active forgetting is sometimes profoundly healthy.
You have to withdraw from translation so that something completely new, a life after the afterlife, can be invented.
And there's the conflict. Laid bare, gradual evolution of tradition, or absolute annihilation to create something radically new.
Okay, the stage shifts dramatically now, and the stakes, they just rise exponentially. Fanon leaves the relative academic freedom of France and takes a position as head doctor at the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital in Algeria. This is 1953.
And this move immediately thrusts him into the sharp, toxic realities of colonialism. He's practicing in segregated wards, European women on one side, Muslim men on the other.
The limits of translation become brutally apparent.
Absolutely. Fanon, he's eager to implement his progressive training, so he immediately implements social therapy, modeling it on his successful work back in St. Alban.
But the source material details what was really a profound and stunning failure of this experiment with the Muslim men.
It was a total failure. He encountered both passive and active resistance to the cultural content. The patients were largely disinterested in the Western-inspired cultural activities he introduced.
The theater, the intellectual journals, the European films.
All of it. Unless those activities had some kind of religious or familial basis that was relevant to their local culture, they just didn't participate in his French-inspired neo-society.
And this failure, it forces an immediate and radical self-critique. Fanon and his intern, Jacques Azoulay, they had to quickly distance themselves from the toxic, racist, pseudoscientific explanations that were common at the time.
Oh, yeah. The notorious Algiers School of Psychiatry, which basically blamed failed treatments on the neurological primitivism or innate incapacity of Muslim patients. It was pure scientific racism.
But their intellectual move here was one of immense courage.
It really was. Instead of resorting to the easy racism of the time, Fanon and Azoulay performed a rigorous self-critique. They realized that they were the ones responsible for the failed encounter. Their first major miscalculation was what they termed a politics of assimilation.
That's fascinating. So they'd approached North Africa as if it were just a provincial part of France, right? Grafting a Western, historically determined method onto a society that just didn't share the historical, cultural, or social conditions that made it work in St. Alban.
They confused a universal concept with a provincial application.
True.
And this failure initiated a necessary intellectual leap to cultural relativism.
They had to provincialize their own therapy, recognize its limits in a specific cultural context before they could even think about reinventing it.
And that process leads to this idea of concrete universality. You take an abstractly universal method, like social therapy, and you make it concrete through radical reinvention in a new cultural context.
That process, provincialization, self-critique, reinvention, that sounds like a classic successful dialectical movement. You negate the flawed assimilationist approach, but you preserve the intent of social engagement, and you arrive at a higher, more culturally sensitive method.
It does. It fits the Hegelian model of translation perfectly. But the source material suggests that this intellectual shift required something even deeper before the dialectical work could even begin.
And what was that?
It required a transmutation of values. They wrote it explicitly. A leap had to be performed. A transmutation of values had to be achieved.
A leap? That sounds like rupture, not synthesis.
Exactly. This meant passing from focusing solely on the biological realm, which was the racist mistake of the Algiers school, to the institutional and cultural existence of the patient. The value of their medical approach had to be annihilated and replaced.
So if translation is just refining an existing value, transmutation of values is a categorical rejection of the old foundation. You're changing the very system by which value is decided.
That's it. So the philosophical friction here is that to describe this necessary change as a leap and a transmutation is to momentarily leap out of dialectical thinking. It's a Nietzschean rupture that's required to void the underlying colonial and racist premises before the Hegelian work of adapting the therapy can even start.
That rupture annihilates the racist values. It's a non-dialectical shift that coexists with the larger dialectical progression.
Before you can translate the method, you need to transmute the values governing the translation itself.
They also ran into another profound issue that challenged the core of their practice: the problem of the untranslatable patient.
Yeah, Fanon, who didn't speak Arabic or Berber fluently at the time, had to rely on an interpreter, and he quickly realized this fundamentally vitiates doctor-patient relations.
The interpreter wasn't just a language bridge, they were a political figure.
Deeply political. The problem was twofold. First, using an interpreter spontaneously triggers a distrust. The patient associated the interpreter, who was often employed by the French administration, with figures of colonial authority.
The judicial system, the police.
Right. So the patient couldn't truly commune with this person or achieve an encounter of equals. And second, the linguistic gap destroyed the richness of the patient's experience. It made a genuine diagnosis almost impossible.
Because the interpreter would often, maybe subconsciously, interpret the patient's complex thoughts according to colonial stereotypes.
Exactly. Fanon cited these powerful examples of condensation. A patient might speak in rich detail for 10 minutes about familial, economic, and political oppression, and the interpreter would sum it all up in 2 dismissive words.
Like what?
He says they took his land, or he says his wife cheated on him. The patient's reality was just reduced to a simple, racist cliché.
So the diagnosis becomes limited, if not impossible. And they concluded that to truly translate social therapy wasn't about translating the patient's words through someone else.
No. It was about the doctor learning the local language. Only then could they conquer the patient's reluctance and achieve a true, unmediated dialectical exchange.
The failure of linguistic translation, the corruption of that mediation, it just drove home the necessity of cultural transmutation. The method itself was toxic if the core relationship was based on that master-slave dynamic enforced by the colonial context.
And this political realization culminates in Fanon's act of absolute rupture, his famous resignation in 1956.
A dramatic protest against practicing psychiatry under conditions of systematized dehumanization during the height of the Algerian Revolution. He was then expelled to Tunisia.
Right. And in Tunis, Fanon shifted his focus entirely. He set up the Neuropsychiatric Day Center and started experimenting with day hospitalization alongside his colleague Charles Geronimi.
And this new method was a structural and philosophical response to the toxic environment he'd just left behind.
The premise was simple but revolutionary. Patients received intensive treatment during the day, engaging in all sorts of therapeutic activities, but, and this is critical, they returned home and to their communities at night. They were never fully isolated.
This approach was effective, easily translatable, and it gave Fanon and Geronimi a concrete model for critique. Their target was the core problem of traditional psychiatric confinement, what they called internment as anti-dialectical subtraction.
Yes. The argument is that traditional asylums only manage symptoms. Because they remove patients from the conflictual situations that cause them, internment ultimately disarticulates the essential relationship between the patient and their environment.
They used incredibly strong political language to describe this removal.
Oh, they did. Internment is subtraction, en soustrait, removal, taking the patient out of the circuitry of social life, or circuiter le malade. This is inherently a non-dialectical procedure.
Because dialectics requires the subject to be in constant conflict and interaction with their environment.
Right. Taking them out of that environment results in what they call the genuine thingification of patients, their reduction to objects, abstracted from a relational reality.
Day hospitalization, on the other hand, forces the psychiatrist to confront the illness as lived by a patient, a personality in crisis within an environment that is still present.
And the conflict is understood correctly as the uninterrupted dialectic of the subject and the world. The psychiatrist's role shifts from being a keeper to being a guide, intervening in that dialectic's movement toward dépassement.
And here's the core rupture that connects the clinical to the political. Fanon and Geronimi assert that day hospitalization breaks resoundingly, brisant de façon éclatante, with the relative and sometimes absolute coercion that internment comes to have.
They're advocating for total freedom for the patient, which challenges the conventional wisdom that confinement is therapeutic.
Let's connect this explicitly to political philosophy, because they rely on it. They directly translate Hegel's master-slave dialectic to theorize these psychiatric encounters. It makes the political dimensions totally unavoidable.
In their view, the traditional asylum creates that carceral, unequal relationship of master and slave. The doctor, by virtue of confinement, holds absolute power, and the patient is stripped of freedom, reduced to a prisoner.
While the day hospital, by contrast, achieves the encounter of two freedoms. That reciprocal recognition between two self-consciousnesses, where doctor and patient can meet as equals.
But now we get to the heart of that intellectual friction again. The critique was worried we'd miss this nuance.
Go on.
If the goal is the encounter of two freedoms, which is the necessary result of the Hegelian progression, and if true freedom requires passing through the slavery stage, why do Fanon and Geronimi describe the transition as a dramatic rupture? Why do they say the master-slave dialectic is being radically broken, as radicalement brisé?
Okay. This is what the source material identifies as the symptomatic slip.
Exactly. The goal is dialectical, the recognition of two freedoms. But the language they use to describe the transition away from the oppressive status quo is pure Nietzschean rupture. If it were a perfect Hegelian process, you'd transition gradually toward dépassement.
Instead, they use the language of shattering and breaking.
So the slip is that the authors, in the heat of this revolutionary insight, are using the philosophical vocabulary of absolute rupture of annihilation to describe an event that immediately results in a structure that is perfectly Hegelian.
They're performing a non-dialectical jump to initiate a new dialectical relationship.
That's it. The larger argument remains, Hegelian change is an uninterrupted dialectic once it's properly set in motion. But the act of achieving that change, the radical transition away from the oppressive, paralyzed system of internment, had to be described in terms of absolute rupture.
Because the status quo was so entrenched, so pathological, that only a shattering could escape the master-slave dynamic. Gradual reform was impossible.
It was impossible because the system was engineered to negate freedom. The moment of absolute break is the necessary violence required to initiate the nonviolent work of recognition.
The political parallel is crystal clear. You cannot reform colonialism gradually. You have to break it resoundingly before true political self-consciousness can emerge.
And to really grasp the intensity of this intellectual split in Fanon's mind, we now have to move backward in time. We're going to his student play, Parallel Hands, drafted in 1949.
This is where the subterranean Fanon gets its most openly combative stance toward dialectics. It's a philosophical argument staged as a Greek tragedy.
The setting is the mythical island of Lesbos. The drama focuses on this central violent act committed by the hero, Epitholos. He kills his father, King Polixos.
Parricide and regicide.
And this act is designed to end 2,000 years of paralyzing stasis, what the text calls eternal calm, inertia, and absolute silence.
So you have Polixos, the father, who embodies the Apollonian tendency, the calm of the sculptor god, fixity, immobility. He is stasis, law, history.
And Epitholos is the Dionysian force. He represents the rhythm of rupture and volcanic extremes. The drama is literally a conflict between the light of fixed tradition and the darkness of explosive revolutionary change.
And Epitholos justifies his act not as a mere reaction, but as a positive force of attack that invents sublime metamorphoses.
This is the language of creation. Crucially, he sees the regicide as an absolute precipice in which dissociation is forged, a force strong enough to rupture history itself.
He's not just replacing the king, he's trying to destroy the very concept of history and fate that's keeping the island stagnant.
It's the moment of pure, unfettered Nietzschean surge. His action is a self-overcoming, aligning perfectly with Zarathustra's creator-annihilator who breaks values and writes new values. Epitholos' exploding fate, expressing a radical freedom that fatally wounds permanence.
And the parallel to Nietzsche's Overman, the Übermensch, is made explicit through other characters, right?
Oh, absolutely. Adeline, a key figure, looks into Epithalos's eyes and sees brilliant superhumanity, and she calls for the annihilation of negations, not their negation.
Which is a philosophical declaration against Hegelian synthesis. She's rejecting the idea of resolving contradictions through compromise.
And the critique offered by Menashe is just as potent and anti-dialectical. She describes Epithalos's movement as inner excitations devoid of reciprocity, with separated spaces being with aborted syntheses. This directly opposes the core requirements of Hegelian reconciliation.
Which requires reciprocity and reasoned synthesis to function.
Right. Epithalos's act is presented as an irrational creative force that affirms absolute difference. But the dialectic doesn't concede easily.
Dialectic strikes back.
Immediately, through the chorus, which is the voice of communal, Benediction wisdom, and they frequently use dialectical reason. They foreshadow the act by saying the spectacle is born from darkness.
Which is a profound philosophical difference. The Dionysian wisdom understands that the spectacular light, the revolution, is already latent in the darkness of the current inertia. It will emerge from it, not absolutely rupture from it.
It's a transformation, not a spontaneous combustion. And the chorus uses that crucial dialectical tool, the double negative. They state, human thought reaching maximal heights cannot not transmute.
Cannot not transmute. That double negative strongly suggests an underlying Hegelian movement, the negation of the negation.
The old order, Polixos, is the negation of thought. He's negated in turn by Epithalos's explosion, which remobilizes consciousness and leads to a higher state of being. The play is staging a full-blown battle between opposing philosophical schools.
Presenting conflicting accounts of the same regicide. Is it a rupture or an inversion?
But the complexity just deepens with a third account, which is the tragic dimension, the tragic repetition and eternal return.
Many characters, especially the women, they see Epithalos's act as a failure, a hamartia, a fundamental mistake.
Exactly. For the character Drana, Epithalos's act isn't creation at all. It's just a faded repetition of the old cycle.
She condemns generations of vainglorious males and suggests that this is just a cyclical relationship of violence, then order, then violence again.
And if that's true, Epithalos's rupture is merely a repetition of the same tragedy that's played out for 2,000 years. He thinks he's creating something new, but he's just contributing to the completion of the cycle.
Which thrusts us right into the dilemma in Nietzsche's own thought. That terrible tension between the doctrine of the overman, you must create something new, and the doctrine of eternal return. The crushing thought that everything will return internally, rendering all creation in vain.
And this tragic failure of absolute creation, it precipitates Adeline's suicide. She sees the circular fatalities, recognizes the futility, and kills herself. This sets up the profound, defeatist ending that Fanon himself later regretted.
Epithalos, realizing his conviction is wavering, begins to stagger. Il vacille.
He descends into melancholy. He accepts defeat and wishes for the night to return. He says, "Night, I beseech you, come back to see no more, to see the void no more."
He's defeated, accepting the inevitable return of the old order. And this deep pessimism is precisely why Fanon asked his brother to destroy the manuscript, recognizing its defeatist overtones.
But the source material provides two powerful alternative readings that pull the ending back from total defeatism. They return us to the complexity of the Fanonian split. The first is the dialectical reinterpretation. We could call it the sacrificial helix.
How does sacrifice become synthesis?
Well, if Epithalos were just repeating history, he'd seize power and declare himself the new king. But the play suggests a second act, his sacrificial self-negation. He exclaims, "I rise up, sacrificial ACT, I rise."
This is interpreted as the true negation of the negation.
Exactly. By sacrificing his own reign, he breaks the cycle of repetition and leads to a rising helix toward the truth and actuality of man. A world without any kings. Revolution, in this view, must pass through tragedy to achieve a higher plane of being. The violence was necessary, but the ultimate overcoming is dialectical.
And the second reading, the non-dialectical reinterpretation.
Courage before the abyss. His vacillation is interpreted as Zarathustra's dizziness before the abyss. The profound suffering that comes with true creation, the uncertainty of building something from nothing. Zarathustra said that courage slays dizziness at the abyss.
So although Epithalos temporarily loses courage, he regains it.
That's the idea. His final words, "I see," pronounced just before the stage lights go out and the house lights turn on, they aren't an acceptance of defeat. They are a regained courage, facing the abyss of light the open possibility of dawn.
He stops staggering and begins to peer into the suffering, clearing the way for the emergence of an entirely new species, the Sarhumanitae, which can't be built on the bonds of the old.
So whether his final realization is the rising helix of Hegelian spirit, or the courageous leap into the Nietzschean abyss, both interpretations affirm that the central act of the play is this struggle for absolute change against a paralyzing stasis.
The violence of annihilation is revealed to be the precondition for any meaningful movement.
So we've traced this fundamental conflict through clinical practice and this explosive student drama. What does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to navigate personal or political change?
We have two Fanons, the Hegelian surgeon of gradual synthesis and the Nietzschean bomber of absolute rupture. They're split, but they are intimately entangled.
We can summarize this internal division by looking at the specific characteristics of their relationship. It's never static, it's a dynamic interplay. Sometimes it's a latent, unresolved tension, like in the clinical debates over dépassement.
Sometimes it's cooperation, like the shock therapy acting as that non-dialectical jolt to kickstart a stalled dialectical process.
And sometimes it's just blatant antagonism, the open philosophical battle staged in parallel hands.
And this division, it persists even in his later, more famous political work, Black Skin, White Masks. The source material highlights a crucial line where Fanon describes the shattering experience of being fixed and thingified by the oppressive colonial gaze.
Yeah, the quote is just devastating. He says, "I lose my temper, demand an explanation, nothing doing. I explode. Here are the fragments put together by another me."
I explode! That is the essential insight. We have the subterranean Nietzschean moment, the sudden bursting into action, the voiding of everything in a whirlwind of explosive energy, the annihilation.
It voids the oppressive identity that's been forced upon him. But then immediately following, you have the dominant dialectical moment. Here are the fragments put together by another me.
The reassembly, the dialectical overcoming that translationally reorganizes the existing fragments into a qualitatively new configuration. The explosion is followed by the painstaking, frustrating work of synthesis.
The relationship is dynamic because the initial explosion avoids the status quo, but the subsequent assembly, governed by the autre moi, the other me, dictates the final form.
And the crucial, ambiguous question Fanon leaves us with is whether that autre moi is simply undoing the explosion by putting the pieces back together according to the old logic, the tragic repetition.
Or if the violence created a void that was necessary for a completely new logic of freedom to govern the reconstruction.
The essential takeaway, then, for anyone trying to understand change is that Fanon's greatest insight lies in this unresolved tension. Change is rarely clean or purely evolutionary.
The non-dialectical jolt, the annihilation, the explosion, is often required to violently interrupt a paralyzing status quo.
Whether that stasis is the chronic neurosis of the nun, the systemic stasis of colonial psychiatry, or the crushing inertia of an oppressive political regime, annihilation is required to clear the slate.
It creates the void, the tabula rasa, needed for the disciplined, frustrating, ongoing dialectical work, the translation and reconstruction, to effectively begin.
Fanon recognized the definitive limits of gradual Hegelian change when you're facing absolute repression. If the framework itself is rigged, you can't work within it.
The moment of rupture is not the goal. It is the precondition for moving from the master-slave dynamic to the encounter of two freedoms.
So the challenge Fanon leaves us with is whether we in our own lives or in our communities are applying a flawed blueprint for change. Are we attempting mere translation when what is truly needed is an act of annihilation?
Which leads to that final provocative thought for you to think about, and it comes straight from Fanon's struggle in parallel hands. If political or personal change feels impossible right now, if you feel trapped in a circular repetition, are you just stuck in a stalled dialectic, trying to translate when you should be transmuting? Or are you just afraid to commit the necessary violent act of self-annihilation to clear the slate and truly start over?
Because if the autre moi, that other me, is putting the exploded fragments back together again, you have to first ask, what logic, whose values are governing that reconstruction?
That void, that moment after the explosion, that is the space where all true creation happens.